Jai Baba. Welcome one and all to this, the first in a new series of videos, this time dedicated to the study and appreciation of Francis Brabazon's epic masterpiece entitled Stay with God, a Statement in Illusion on Reality. Francis Brabazon was one of Meher Baba's disciples who met him in 1952, and from 1959 to 1969 lived with Meher Baba at Meherabad and Brabazon, Pune as one of the resident mandali. Stay with God was one of many books of poetry which Francis wrote in Meher Baba's service, and was most highly appreciated by Meher Baba himself, who, among many other things, which I'll be going into more in this session, said that it was a masterpiece second in importance only to God Speaks itself. The title of this series of videos is Stay with God, Francis Brabazon's epic masterpiece, as a proclamation of Meher Baba's Avatarhood and foundation laying for the New World civilization. This book, published in 1959, is really unparalleled in the Meher Baba library. It's a presentation of Meher Baba like no other, a work of magnificence and beauty. This series will run to something like 16 of these sessions, and I'll be showing you presently the sequence of sessions that I've worked out. But before, let me hear, this slide here shows you the title page to Stay with God in its original 1959 edition, signed by Meher Baba himself. He signed many of the original copies. And this slide here shows you Francis Brabazon. He's up in the top left there with the hat. With Meher Baba, you can see Erich just to the right of Baba, during the Meher Baba's Andhra tour in 1954. Francis Brabazon was the only Westerner, I think, invited by Baba to join him on the course of that tour. Before doing anything more, since we are dealing here with poetry, I'd like to read the opening 7 stanzas from Stay with God. We're going to spend a lot of this series reading some of the poetry, because appreciation of the beauty of the expression is much of the pleasure and delight involved in studying a book like this. So this is the very opening of an epic. It has an epic proem with which it starts. So this is book 1. There are 5 books in Stay with God. This is from book 1. Wings toward the glaciers of Kailash, where the first fathers nourished the seed of God, and Siva gentled Ganga, and Parvati walked by streams of living heart. For Siva was Jesus before him, and Parvati his loveliness in the earth, as was Rama, as was Krishna, as was Abraham and Zarathustra and Buddha and Muhammad in their loveliness, God's avatar, as is now Baba. Sing, Baba, your descent this time on earth, your brightness in our night, your comfort in our separation. For it is my love's desiring, Baba, to compose a book on this theme which you set me, and to this task my spirit spreads its wings only to fall stifled and overcome, the song groaning within my breast, impossible of utterance. For only a perfect master can speak a book, and sainthood is the least qualification to sing of you, although a profound scholarship is sufficient for the assembling of mere facts. But I have neither devotion nor learning for the task. In the past, you had Vyasa and Homer and Valmiki and many others who were your name and yourself, to leave your name in impassioned imprisonment of words. And saints innumerable who picked up the threads of your name's loveliness and wove them into bright patterned verses. Only if you, Baba, sustain my flight, give knowledge to my intellect, and unbind the empathy of my heart, can this work be done. Not miracle, but faith. Faith that is grace, and grace your miracle. Ignorant men, men of domestic culture, say that Jesus was the first bringer of love. Despicable is their doctrine, having it that before this, God was loveless. And other ignorant men have it that love is now sealed, that there is no further need of his descent and example. Love does not admit of a first or a last. God is never more nor less. All his bright messengers were nothing but love, and the essence of love, sun bright and wholly perfect. Moses was this, for he said, love God with your whole heart and soul. Sakyamuni was this, for he showered men the way of release and bliss. And the 24 Buddhas before him, for they were all releasers. And Zarathustra was this same flame, because he told men, when you behold the sunrise, or by your hearth fire, remember the light in your hearts. Rama was this, because his arrows were a rain of love. Abraham was this, because he told men to destroy their idols. And of love was Pallas Athena, because she put courage in wayfaring into Telemachus's heart. And of love was Apollo, because his sign was the sun, and whatever men love is of the sun, whether of sky or of heart, whether of creature or of God. And of love was Chaitanya, for he repeated one word, Krishna. And was Shankaracharya this too, for he said many words explaining that all men were God, and the rest of them, the 84,000, who were nothing but love. But if we could name a first, a clear emblem amidst the lovely occasions of God, let it be Krishna, whose flute is the multitude of men's hearts from the dawn of love, from the dawn of time till now. For if God did not love music, the world would never have come into being. And if men did not love music, they would never get to God. It is better to reverence all his names and say Baba, who is the love now and the glory and the awakening and the afresh path setting. So that's the opening 7 stanzas of Book 1, and it gives a sense of the magnificence and splendor of the poetic presentation of Meher Baba that this poem, this epic poem, carries out. To points worth noting right from the start are these. Stay with God, this section, the proem to Stay with God, and the poem as a whole is a declaration and celebration of Meher Baba's avatarhood. Baba had declared himself to be Avatar in 1954, the year before Baba gave Francis the instruction to write this poem. And it's a presentation of Baba's avatarhood without parallel. Another point which you may have noticed in hearing and reading these 7 stanzas is that Stay with God is full of allusions, names and allusions all over the place. One of the great accomplishments, one of the great pieces of work of Stay with God is to place Meher Baba's advent in a vast cultural context. So over these sessions that follow this, we'll be talking about all of these things. Baba's avatarhood as Francis presents it, and the vision that Francis gives, which centers on the book's title, Stay with God. That is a title that Baba himself gave to Francis, and it is the great theme of the entire epic poem. Now, this series of videos is, of course, to be found on youtube.com/Meherabad, and also on facebook.com/Meherabad. And if you go to those places, you can find a link to various materials. We will place on there a listing, a kind of a syllabus of the 16 sessions I have planned out now. We might wind up expanding this or changing it as we progress. Also, I have a developed study guide for each session with a description of some of the contents and a whole series of questions relating to that. I would, for those who would like to become regulars or view this series as a whole, I would recommend reading the relevant portions before the video that covers it. It will make the video presentation more meaningful to you. Also, every Sunday afternoon we're going to have a live discussion among those who would like to participate. You can find again on YouTube and Facebook the link whereby you can join in, you can either listen in or you can participate, speak up, and we'll be discussing the video that went up the week before. That is 4 o'clock India time, Meherabad time, so you might have to adjust. If you're in Australia, it might be you'll be several hours later in the day. If you're in Europe, you'll be 5-6 hours later. If you're in America, it'll be 9.5 to 12.5 hours later. You have to check the schedule, the time differences between these different places. This is a glimpse of what this program will hold. This is sort of a syllabus that I created. So this first session is going to be an introduction to the poem as a whole and to Francis Brabazon in his life. The session 2 will give a introduction to especially the front matter of the book and other general perspectives on the structure of Stay with God as a poem. And I'll just scroll through this quickly. You can see here, Stay with God is divided into 5 books, book 1, book 2, book 3, that's what it's called. In fact, let me show you the table of contents, which is right here. I'll expand it. These are the 5 books. Let me read out the titles of them. Meher Baba, The Occurrence of Reality in Illusion. This is a biography of a poetic biography of Meher Baba from birth until 1955, which is when Francis got the order to write the poem. But it's much more than just a biography. It has magnificent poetic digressions. Book 2, The Love Song of John Carey, Illusion Singing to Reality. John Carey is the pseudonym that Francis uses for himself. It's his own love song to Meher Baba. It's extremely beautiful, very deep, personal, passionate expression of love for the Master. Book 3 is entitled God Speaking, the question which reality asked itself, and the beginning of illusion and its end. You may notice that God Speaking is very close to the title God Speaks. Well, when Francis was given the order to write this book, which was at a Sahavas Baba held at Meherabad in November 1955, that exact same month, God Speaks was published. So God Speaks is built into Stay with God in many ways. This particular section, Book 3, tells the story of what Baba called the divine theme, or the journey of the soul. So if you look at these 3 books, I'm giving you a picture of what the whole poem is about. The first is Meher Baba personally, his life. The second book is Baba as the divine beloved of lovers, because it's a lover singing his passionate, agonied, blissful expression of love to Baba. It really is quite a stirring and moving love poem. And the third is showing the avatar as the creator of the universe and the only one within creation. It's telling the story of God impersonal and the entire universe that comes out of him. You see what a conception of Meher Baba this is. The person, the beloved, and the creator of the entire universe. The last 2 books are quite different. Book 4 is called The Steps to His Feet, Abandoning Illusion for Reality. And this could be characterized as almost, Francis Brabazon had been a Sufi sheikh before coming into Baba's fold. And it's almost like guidance for seekers for how to get to the path, or how to get to the feet of the Master or of the Divine Beloved. And Book 5, The God-Man as World Axis and Living Perfection of Art, the Divine Sun of Reality shining through the mists of illusion. This is very long. It's 40%, almost more than 40% of the entirety of Stay with God. And world access, by the way, that phrase is an English rendering of the Persian term kutub, which means a pole or axis. This is a vast treatment of culture and human civilization and art, and the role which it ought to be playing in the service of God. And Francis elaborates at great length on the need of art to ground itself in God, the need of culture to ground itself in God. And he's highly critical of what has happened to civilization in recent centuries in departing from God. Thus the title, Stay with God. So this is a picture of the book as a whole. And as I was reviewing, session 7 there are 2 sessions we'll have devoted to the love song. Then book 3, 2 sessions devoted to this presentation of the divine theme, a session devoted to the steps to his feet, and then we'll devote 3 sessions to this final long book on civilization and art. Now, here are some more thoughts and comments on Stay with God, what it's like and part of what it does. It seems to me, as I've been saying, to serve, broadly speaking, two purposes. One is a presentation of Meher Baba in this magnificent and vast way, as I've been describing. I hope you can see that the breadth and depth and imaginativeness of this presentation is something that no other book can offer us. We're showing the life story, the beloved, the whole divine theme narrative. But I wanted to say, talk a little bit, particularly about the last book and what you'll find there. It's Francis is focusing on art and culture and the need to rededicate it to God. And now, when Francis talks about art and culture, he doesn't mean just art like the fine arts or things like that. He means something much more than that. So I'd like to say a little bit about culture, what its significance is, and the role which I think Stay with God will play in the future in the establishment of a Baba culture and a new world civilization. Culture means more than just high culture. It's not just going to symphonies or, classical sitar concerts or visiting museums. It's much more than that. And Francis really spells this out in Stay with God. By culture, we mean the assimilation of spirituality and love for God into life. You might say it's the patterns and habits of life. So here are a few passages from Stay with God where Francis enunciates that theme. This one right here from Stay with God, page 91. Francis is reviewing civilizations of the past when people were more attuned to God. So, once men sang purely in the work of their hands, in the speech of their mouths. They knew that the Avatar and the perfect masters were the only God on earth, and that the saints were the doors to him. By God men lived, and his name wrought their works. They went not out to labor, nor sat down to meat, without song attending. The leftover scraps from their singing we have gathered into our galleries and libraries to worship or stare at. You see, those last two lines are extremely sarcastic. He said, the real thing is to be remembering him, singing him, praising him when you go out to work or when you sit down to eat a meal. And nowadays, we just put it into museums. That's the pale shadow of what real culture is. Here's another passage like this. Now he's going through the different avatars. After Zarathustra, the light purely again in men's eyes, brightly between lovers and above the marriage bed. And in conversation and contracts. You see, he's talking about art in this way. You make a contract. You go to bed with your wife at night. You have chats with people. God is in these things. This is where art is, in every moment of living. After Abraham, the settled life in obedience to God's voice. Consequently, friendship between men. Who had what to fear from whom? The tent pitched or struck at his word, right? You're talking about a very nomadic existence. You set up a tent and then you move your flocks to somewhere else. This is done at his word. God's guidance is there. I do not bow down before that which rises and sets. after the wanderings of Rama and Sita and Lakshman, the pure dignity of women established, and brotherliness without jealousy. Here's another passage expressing some of this theme. In a real cultured civilization, you have learned men able to read hearts and the signs of God in the wind, in the fire, in the green earth, capable of writing the word love into the work of their hands, their swordsmanship and plowing, their pots in which they drew water and cooked their food and offered sacrifice to God. You see what art is? Art is in everything in life where God is built into that. That's what Francis really wants to talk about, this higher sense of it. You could say, if you're a businessman, making a good product or having honest interactions with people. When I go to the Meher Center, this example comes in Myrtle Beach, they sweep the paths every day, free of needles, pine needles. Somehow the way they do it when you walk down those paths makes you feel this was done for the sake of love. Who would care about how you sweep a path? But somehow it has that quality. Francis himself, in the early years, when Baba was coming to Australia, built a whole house in Sydney. It's still there. It's called Meher House, out of stone. And there are photographs of his doing this. The way that you cut a stone, the way you place stones in their place. He learned this craft from master builders in the neighborhood. God is built in these things. You see what a vast idea of culture this is. It's everything we do should be built on it, not just singing a song or painting a painting or writing a poem. It's not just in those things at all. Those are the high culture that have a certain role and give a certain focus, but it's meant to extend to everything. Now, my feeling is this, that I'm going to say a few words about our Meher Baba culture right now. For most of the time after Meher Baba dropped his body, a culture was getting built, and it was particularly established on the guidance and precedent set by Meher Baba's Mandali, his close disciples. Not just that, but they played a very big role. And their habits, the way that Alaba would call people for tea in the afternoon, or the way that you would take your shoes off before going into Mandal, all these little tiny things were imbued with the feeling of how life was lived around Meher Baba. Well, those disciples are all gone now. They've all passed away. And in a way, I would say that many of Baba's followers were unconsciously imbibing a whole way of life that prevailed around Baba, a life based on his remembrance. It was deeply a Meher Baba culture. But what it was not was a self-conscious awareness of that. Nobody thought about it. We just took it for granted. Because that was the order of things back then. When you were with Baba, you wouldn't say, Baba, are you creating a certain culture around you? Of course you wouldn't. You would be with him. And that sense of his presence has been shared until now. But now we're more than 50 years out from his having dropped his body. And it is time to develop some real awareness of that culture. And that's where Stay With God has a big role to play, because Francis is bringing to bear a tremendous amount of appreciation and discrimination on matters of culture, what keeps us with God and where people have departed from God. There's no other book like it that I'm aware of. And I think that as we consciously try to build a culture and a world civilization on this new avataric advent, this book will be tremendously helpful in that enterprise. Now, I this may be a time to bring up one of the very prominent aspects of Stay with God that people cannot fail to notice as they read the poem. It is highly critical of many aspects of civilization, particularly modern civilization. It's really quite harsh. I find it to be quite enjoyable. Perhaps some people get put off by it sometimes. Francis will go over the history of art and he'll tear people to pieces, including artists or musicians or writers who you may happen to like. So I want to say something about this and what the role of it is. Here's what Francis himself wrote about it in the preface, as shown on this slide. I'm going to read this out. He says, "If I had been born in another time or place, I would have only sung his praise. Analysis and comment would never have occurred to me, they being foreign to art, except when, after becoming a real artist, one by choice becomes a teacher. But being born when I was, and having lived my life in a portion of the world in which all utterance is contaminated by self-interest, the avoidance of comment is impossible. I ask the reader to allow that although some of this comment may seem harsh, it is directed at conditions rather than persons. It is personal only to the extent that persons are identified with conditions, the world of false values that I attack, and that I myself, my own condition, is the target it has hit before it touches anyone else. Myself being the world of false values, because it is myself who, by having turned away from the eternal truths, from the virtue of man, created the false values. But I hope that my comment will sometimes be entertaining." So here are some illustrations of the kind of harsh criticism that you'll find. Okay, let me just read this. He's gone through, he's really especially critical of Western civilization, to tell the truth. He clearly feels that the West, since the time of the Renaissance, around 1500 or so, departed from God and has really fallen away. So he'll say, this is what can be salvaged from this disaster. I'm just going to read a couple lines to illustrate. Since Dante and Chaucer, a handful of work of Shakespeare, subtracting what he said from what he was paid to say. Well, William Shakespeare, universally held to be the greatest writer in English and one of the supremely greatest writers of the entire Western world. Well, it's okay, except when he was, just selling out, subtracting what he said. So here he trashes William Shakespeare, for heaven's sakes. I'm just giving you a few examples to illustrate. Here's another one. Since Dante, all right, I'll just say that Dante, one of the widely held to be the greatest medieval poet of Europe, he really savages Dante for having written his Divine Comedy. Now, and also the artist Michelangelo, you may have heard of Michelangelo, often held to be the greatest painter and sculptor of the Western world. He tells him he has craft but has none of the spirit of true art. Or Beethoven, he says, well, Beethoven, when he actually managed to shut up, he wrote some nice sonatas, but his symphonies were blasting. Here's an example of the sort of thing he says, to give you an idea of this criticism. And Inayat Khan said, in India, the idea has always been towards music of a single instrument, suitable for a cave, a grass hut, or a temple, and a solo singer. In the West, they're like an orchestra, can be heard through a park. Now Francis says, one would wonder why a man who wants to show some devotion to God, to make sounds well-pleasing to him, should need 100 instruments, perhaps an organ, and 200 men and women bawling and screaming at one another. Okay, we're talking about most Western classical sacred music for several hundred years, which has a huge symphony orchestra and a huge chorus. One would suppose he thought that God was a long way off or had brass ears. If you want to sing to God, why do you need 200 people shouting at the top of their voice? One wonders why they want to play piano faster and faster. Minute waltz got down to 51.2 seconds. And make notes and so forth. He goes on like this. I'm just giving you a few little samples of the harsh criticism that he directs at some of the greatest artists who have ever lived. This is not because he doesn't recognize the genius of Shakespeare or Beethoven. He had the highest opinion of and all of that. But his criticisms, even though they're quite cutting and sarcastic, always have a good point. He's pointing to how art gets away from God with even the greatest. And I feel that a great service that, I'm bringing up these examples, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Shakespeare. I mean, we're talking about, Everest, Mount Everest, K2, the highest, greatest achievements of Western art. When he takes those on, he's saying, we don't have to bow down before these things. The point is not great art. The point is God. You have to stay with God. So a lot of the sharp criticism, and when we got to book 5, we'll really be dealing with a lot of this, is a display of extraordinarily acute discrimination, where he'll take great works of art and really show where they have held to the truth and where they have deviated from it. So when I'm talking about building a new, you don't have to agree with all of Francis's opinions. I don't think, you don't have to think that Shakespeare was a sellout or that Michelangelo didn't have any sense of God or anything like that. I mean, obviously you don't need, or that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is just 200 instruments and chorus blasting at each other as though God couldn't hear it. You don't have to take those opinions literally. I'm saying this because some people get offended by Francis's caustic, sharp opinions, but always within what he says, there is a really good point. And that is what I think the future of humanity will absorb as we try to build a new civilization based on God. So to summarize what I'm trying to say here about Stay with God, this is to try to bring out what I feel is part of its significance. There is no other book in the Meherabad library that does this. A civilization is going to be built on this Avataric Advent. It always happens. Part of the work of the Avatar is to transform humanity, and that entails civilizations being built on basis. Like in Europe, those magnificent cathedrals are expressions of the Christian vision of things. In India, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata are magnificent expressions of how to live a life on basis of the Dharma and devotion to the Avatar of the age. Always this happens. It's going to happen again. And I think that Stay with God has beams of guidance all over the place, like no other book that has ever, that has so far been composed. Let me read to you, before I turn to Francis Brabazon and his own life, a few comments that Meherabad himself made about this book. So I'd like to read a few of the comments that Baba himself made about Stay with God. This is from the introduction to a new edition of Stay with God that's going to be published soon. Francis brought the poem with him when he came to live with Baba in 1959. So here's a letter he wrote back to his friends in Australia about reading the poem to Baba. In a letter which he wrote to several of his close associates in Australia, probably in late February 1959, Francis gave his own description of the experience of orally rendering the poem to Baba and the reception that it received. By the way, he read the complete poem 3 times and portions of it much more than that. He writes, "The miracle which I hoped for, yet dared not hope for when I was writing Stay with God, apparently occurred. It is apparently a proper job." Baba says, "It is second only to God Speaks, and even gives God Speaks life, and that it is unique, inasmuch as never before, during any of his incarnations," means avataric incarnations, "has such a book been written." And he says, "If this is what I, God, feel, what must posterity think, and how it will be moved when it reads it?" And he has said, "I'm not just humoring you, Francis, it is a fact. Although I cannot believe all this, I cannot disbelieve it, and the morning reading sessions bear out that he means it. They are almost like the Qawwali sessions I have described to you, which took place at Meherabad in 1955. Baba has passages repeated again and again, whilst gesturing approval and elucidation to the Mandali audience. Francis was reading this at Meherabad in Mandali Hall with all the Mandali in attendance. Here's some more on this. Although the women Mandali did not participate in these divine wine of poetry drinking bouts with the men in Mandali Hall, apparently some of the exuberant mood from these sessions carried over when Baba returned each day for his time on the women's side, Meherabad, as Baba's own Mera related in a letter to an American correspondent. So this is Mera writing. "Baba says this book is a masterpiece, she wrote. It is so beautifully written. To quote Baba, she went on, he who will read this book will have read everything. Indeed, we have never before seen Baba so enthusiastic." Baba's response was further dilated upon by his sister Mani in a family letter that she sent out to Baba's Western followers at that time. Baba, quote, this is Mani now, said that the unique fact of this epic of living avatar being written during his lifetime and being heard by him in physical form will have a great bearing and significance for posterity. Among the things he said in praise of it was, "My love will touch the heart of all who read it, as no book has ever done." So that's Mani. "The book contains food for the brain and a feast for the heart," Baba said later in an interview with one of his Indian lovers. The powerful integration of concentrated, sublime thinking and intense feeling seems to have been a characteristic of the poem that Baba especially liked. As Francis himself conveyed in another of his letters to his friends in Australia, "I think the highest praise that Baba gave Stay with God was, it will appear both to the highest intellects and to those with simple hearts." And I personally feel this really captures much of the essence of Stay with God. It is intellectually brilliant, and it is deeply felt and deeply passionate. There's no other Baba book that's quite like it in that respect. Okay, so this has been a general introduction and appreciation of Stay with God and the series that we're going to be having. So the next video will turn to Francis Brabazon himself. I'll be giving an account of his life, which is a very interesting one, and more specifically, how the book Stay with God got written. That will be the topic of the next session. So that's all for today. Avatar Meherabad Ki Jai.